Rashi had explained in Pasuk Zayin when it says Poru vayishritzu, the Bnei Yisrael, they were fruitful, and yishritzu. Literally, it could mean they were teeming. But Rashi explains why do we use the term of sheret? It's something so denigrating, rodents. Shoyoldos shisha b'keres echod. When they gave birth, it was 6 in each litter. As a rodent, when it gives birth, it's 6 in one litter. Identically, that's how they gave birth. If you look in the Sifarno, Porah vayishritzu, acha shemesu kol shivim nefesh. After all the 70 individuals who came to Egypt had passed away, notu ledarki shrotzim. They went in the direction of rodents. They behaved like rodents. Meaning that, as I mentioned yesterday, the behavior of the Jews after that generation passed away, since there was no longer those role models, they went immediately. They changed in their behavior to a degree that they weren't recognizable, that they were part of the original family. The Gemara tells us in Brachos that Shlomo Melech's Rebbe was Achi Ashiloni. That was his Rebbe. And he did not marry Bas Paro until his Rebbe passed away. And therefore, the Gemara says it's important to live in the community where your Rebbe lives. As we see by Shlomo Melech, that as long as his Rebbe was alive, he did not marry Bas Paro, but when his Rebbe passed away, he married her. So the question is, Shlomo Melech was the Chochem Mikol Adam. He was the wisest man who ever lived. So whatever the justification was, a level of genius, which in the history of existence, a genius has never existed, he justified it. So if his Rebbe would have felt it was inappropriate, he could explain to his Rebbe with his genius why it is appropriate. So why did he have to wait for his Rebbe to pass away, and only then did he marry Bas Paro? That's the question I asked. So what I explained was that you have every answer in the book, convincing, irrefutable answer. You can't poke any holes in that answer. But if your Rebbe's alive and your Rebbe says, it's not right, it's wrong, explain to me why it's wrong. Because it's wrong. But I explain to you why it's right. You can explain to me from now forever. It's wrong. It's Shlomo Melech understood that his Rebbe would not approve of it because he felt it was not right. He would not marry Bas Paro. It was only after he passed away, only then, since that representation of disagreement no longer existed, that's when he married Bas Paro. So I'm saying, as long as that generation was alive, being there, that was the conscience of all the Jews. Although they would like to be like the Egyptians, whatever it may be, but they're not walking out the door till that generation is no longer here. Only when they're no longer here, now we could somehow rationalize, justify, for whatever way they justified it, we're going to be like the Egyptians, and their behavior was similar to rodents. Many years ago, people had certain types of grandmothers. They had it was called a Yiddish Baba, a very Jewish grandmother. And when they were dating, they dated women that weren't appropriate, and they wouldn't dare marry the shiksa until that grandmother passed away. Once the grandmother passed away, somehow it was okay that's when they decided they could marry the shiksa. Until then, they would never consider it because they couldn't hurt their grandmother. There they couldn't hurt her. But that deemed that, so you could say if they'd hurt, because she doesn't understand. Deep down, you understand it's not appropriate. But you're going to say it's okay because she's from the old world, not from the new world, whatever the way they wanted to frame it. But it was the same idea. But here, as long as that generation existed, those 70 people, they did not turn to the way of the rodents, to behave like rodents, which being within the spiritual context. There's an interesting Sefarno in this week's Parsha. If you read the Medrash, that Amram was the leading Torah sage of the generation, Moshe's father. And when they came up with the idea, Paro, and he said, it says Perach, he sweet talked the Jewish people. He says, you people, why don't you help me advance this country? We're going to build it together. Since he took off his regal garments and he started to work with mortar and brick, making bricks, and he said to the Jews, why don't you help me? And the Jews, feeling they were beneficiaries of the hospitality of the country, they're going to participate. Amram said to them, don't show them your ability. The moment they see your capability, they're going to lock you into that, and they're going to enslave you, and they're going to demand those quotas. This is what Amram says to them. The only tribe which listened to Amram was Shevet Levi, which was his own tribe. Shevet Levi did not participate. So Levi, they never recognized and realized the capability of Levi. The others who showed their capability, they were able to produce so many bricks. They locked them into that quota. Every day we expect that quota of bricks. The others, Levi, who did not show, therefore Levi was not part of the bondage because they listened to Amram. This is explicit in the Midrash. But the Sepharo says over here, the last of Yaakov's sons to pass away was Levi. And because his family was exposed and they were under his tutelage, the longest of all the tribes, that's the reason why they did not go out of the door. Therefore, Levi never became over the Avodah Zarah. They never became idolaters, pagans in Egypt for that reason. Because they had that role model and they had the tutelage of their great-grandfather or maybe great-great-grandfather, and that held them in place. So it was only after the whole generation passed, but even Levi, not being the head of that particular tribe, that he was alive, the Jews couldn't behave a certain way because he was a representation of that original group. Once he passed away, the other tribes, they went south totally, and the behavior was similar to shrotzim, to rodents. Pasuk Ches, Vayokem el chodosh al Mitzrayim. A new king arose over Egypt, Asher lo yodas Yosef, who did not know Yosef. So there's an argument in the Gemara, Rav and Shmuel. What does Melech Chodosh mean? What does it mean? A new king? And he didn't know Yosef because he had no relationship with him. This is not the old Paro. Or Melech Chodosh means it was a new mandate. That's the Melech Chodosh. And what it means, Lo Yodas Yosef, he behaved as if he did not know Yosef. Because if he would have understood who Yosef was, there's no way he could have mistreated his family the way he mistreated them, which is the bondage, right? It's one of two interpretations. But whatever the interpretation is, he never knew him or he didn't know he behaved that way. But factually speaking, Yosef is part of Egyptian history. Yosef is recent. And it was known, if not for Yosef, there wouldn't be in the Egyptian people. So even though you didn't personally know him, but being part of the history of Egypt, and Egypt only exists because of him, how do you behave this way? It seemed to be he had to somehow in his mind behave as if he didn't know Yosef, as if that historical fact didn't exist. Because if it was, he couldn't have behaved and decreed and put all the restrictions on the Jews and enslaved them. So we explained yesterday, it says Vayishritzu. The way the Sepharno learns, the descendants of those original 70 people, their behavior was so extremely different, they couldn't be recognized they were part of the same family. Not to be recognized. When you see them as no connection to the original people, then even you no longer have that conscience issue. Not bother with a conscience. I didn't know Yosef personally. If I would have known him, I couldn't. It's part of history. It seems to me these people have no relevance to that historical fact. If that's the case, I'm able to institute the slavery, which he did. That's Melech Chodosh Ashel Yoda. Either way, he had to still deal with his conscience and the conscience of the people. Ashel Yoda, Osa Atzmo Ki Lo Yoda. V'yomer lamo, hine am b'nei Yisrael, rav otzim imenu. He said to his people, he said, El amo, hine am b'nei Yisrael. Egyptian was the height of civilization. He says, the am, we're a nation, they're a nation. Rav otzim imenu. They're more numerous and they're more powerful than we are. Therefore, it's the question is, it's either them or us. It's he spoke to Amo, and he said, Am b'nei Yisrael. He didn't say the Jews. They're an entity that we have to deal with. We have to contend with them because they're also they're Am b'nei Yisrael today. Hova nischak malo. We have to outwiser them. We have to outsmart them. Pen yirbe. Because maybe they're going to increase. Because if there should be a war, they'll join our enemies, and they will fight against us, and they'll force us out of the land. So, of course, the question is, Rashi addresses it. It should say, and we will be forced to leave the land. All that means they will leave. So Rashi addresses it before we go earlier. Meaning it's a whole psychological issue. Just to destroy a nation, to enslave a free people, especially where you're beholden to that people, it's not easy. We have to go and we have to prepare ourselves to this, because if you appreciate the issue, then you're not going to have difficulty doing this. Nischakmo lo nischak malasos lo. Rabbi Senu Dorshu ischakim lo mishin shalishol don v'mayim. We have to deal intelligently, wisely, to deal with the Redeemer of Israel, who's ultimately to be judged by water. Why? Their God promised he will never bring another flood on the world. So Rashi in the parentheses, they made a mistake. They thought that he will not bring it even on a location, but Hashem said on the whole world. So according to the Medrash, the Egyptians were astrologers, and they knew that ultimately there's going to be a redeemer. And we have to contend with that issue to keep them under lock and key. I mean, according to that interpretation, if the Moshe Shel, he's the redeemer and he's taken him out of Egypt, so what's this whole idea of joining with the enemy? It has nothing to do with joining with the enemy, right? They'll join with the enemy. V'olam min haaretz, al kochenu absen darshu ka'adam shemakal al atzmo v'tol kilosa b'acherim. When a person curses himself, he doesn't want to address the curse on himself. So he addresses it, focuses on someone else. V'reyu kilu kosa v'alinu min haaretz v'em Yeshua. We will leave the land and they'll take over. What's the Moshe Shel Yisrael? So you have to, according to that, Moshe Shel said the Redeemer means he'll be the leader and he'll unite them, galvanize them, and he will lead the rebellion. Right now you have all these sleeping cells. You have all these unlimited numbers of Jews. Once that leader comes, who's going to be Redeemer, he'll unite them and they'll force us out of the land. The other interpretation is Paro understood that the financial backbone of Egypt, ultimately of the Jewish people, with such numbers, those numbers leave the land, what's left? Relatively speaking, you have a paltry number left. So it's important to keep them here. That will guarantee our physical and financial viability if they're here. Because ultimately there's going to be a Moshiach who's going to take them out of here. And that ultimately was really the reality. Once we were enslaved, and we were the basis for we were the financial backbone of Egypt, what would be if we would leave? The land is depleted, literally stripped to nothing. And especially then we borrowed all their personal effects. We took the wealth out of Egypt. We left them bereft. And that's why they pursued us, for that reason. Over here, the Balturm says Havo. Ola Yud Beis. The word Havo numerically is 12. Kloma Shnischakim al Shnei Masor Shvotim. We have to outsmart the 12 tribes. That's Hava Nischak Malo. We have to deal with the Hava. Term says, white that will join with our enemies and what? And they'll force us out of the land. So he explains, Yosef was the viceroy of Egypt. During the famine, what happened? All the wealth of the world came to Egypt because the famine affected even Canaan. And he had depleted the world of its wealth. So the reason why the nations of Canaan are going to join with the Jews in Egypt, because they're coming to recoup the money that the Egyptians had taken from them. Yosef had taken the money because he sold the food. All their silver, all their wealth was in Egypt. So when the Jews become empowered, they're going to be the fifth column, and they're going to join with their enemies because they're coming back to take their wealth. Because Egypt depleted Canaan. This is the way he explains it, the Sefarno. But it's interesting. You think of it. You know, when we speak about anti-Semitism, it works in every direction. You know, the Nazi Yimach Shmo said the Jew's the communist. The communist says the Jew is something else. You can't win. If you're a Jew, you're not a communist, and if you're a communist, the Nazi wants to destroy you. So from every side of the equation, you can't exist. The Sepharda says something phenomenal. When Paro heard that Yosef's family came to Egypt, it says, Vayitav be'enei Paro be'enei avon. They were all excited. Why were they excited? This is really the core of anti-Semitism. So he says, why? Before Yosef's family came, it says Yosef already depleted the world of its wealth. If not for Yosef, there would have been in Egypt. He prepared Egypt for the famine. Why was Vayita? Because until now, Yosef was only a sojourner. He didn't give us his all. But now that his family is here, he's going to be dedicated to a greater degree because now he's going to do it for his family. Yeah, this. Yosef already gave him a pound of flesh with both arms. But you know something? He really hasn't given us his best. But now that his family's here, he will give us his best. You understand? Yeah, but you hear the way an anti-Semite thinks. How could he have done better? Yosef was at a level of integrity and ability. If not for Yosef, it wouldn't be in Egypt. And Egypt is what is thriving despite everything. And the wealth of the world already came to Egypt. Still hasn't given us his best. But now that his family's here, now definitely he'll be dedicated because his family's here. This is the way Paro saw it. So now, this Jew who was the viceroy of Egypt, he took all our money, all our wealth. They're coming after us, the Egyptian said. So how does Canaan, in truth, Canaan sees this Jew, he orchestrated, he depleted us. Because he wouldn't give us the food unless we gave him the pound of flesh. And the Egyptians see the Jews are here, you know something? They're going to join with their enemies. When they come to get their wealth, they're going to join with them. So from both sides of the equations, the Egyptian doesn't trust the Jew, and the Canaanite doesn't trust the Jew, because the Jew who headed Egypt, he took all their wealth. Why by the Akedah? Yitzchak was the most beloved. It says Hashem Berech is Avram Bakol. Bakol is Bigmatria Bend. Yitzchak was Avram's whole life, everything. The destiny of the world was Yitzchak. And yet, when Hashem said to him, bring him up as a burnt offering, this is the Akedah, Vayashkim Avram Baboker. He rose early in the morning, hitched his own donkey to bring his own son as a sacrifice. At that moment, he thought he would be slaughtering him. Despite the fact that he was everything. If Hashem says, bring him as an offering, you bring him as an offering. Even though it was contradictory in his mind, as the Chazal tell us, here he says he's the future, now he's telling him to end it. He didn't ask the question. So there's a midrash, and Rabbi Shlomo speaks about this. When Avram went to the Kedah, as it says, he went with alacrity, nothing could deter him. But simultaneously, there were copious tears that he was crying when he was going to the Akedah. Now, how do you reconcile the two? Here, he's committed, rises early, doing it with a level of fervor that even Satan can't stop him. A raging river, he's going. And yet, he's crying, he's shedding tears because his beloved son is going to be killed. How do you reconcile the two? So Rabbi Yisrael Salanta explains with an allegory. The person's a great Torah sage, and he has a beloved student, one of a kind, and he loves the student because he mentors him, and he's almost like a reflection of him in his greatness in Torah. And he has a child who he loves his child, but consciously he loves the student more than his own child. Middle of the night, they're sleeping, and this student is so close, he treats him like family. He lives in the house. Middle of the night, all of a sudden the father hears fire. To who does the father run to save? The child or the student? He runs to save the child. Why? Because the student is special, because I understand he's special because he is. Because I mentored, he's so special, he has such knowledge. The child's your child. You love your child because it's your child. It has nothing to do with what you understand. It's just a reality. So the two things that play simultaneously in the person, your emotion and your intellect. The intellect, you absorb or feel things because of what you understand. But your feelings emanate from what you feel. So in terms of what he was going to do, he understood its value. But in terms of his feelings for losing a son that was born to him at the age of 100, emotionally he has pain from this. So simultaneously, he was shedding copious tears, although he did it with alacrity and nothing could stop him. Okay, this is the introduction of what I'm going to say. We find that when Esav parted from Yaakov, it says the land could not carry them because they had such wealth. Esav had wealth and Yaakov had wealth. So Yaakov says to Esav, there's a debt that has to be paid. What's the debt? Whoever is going to be the heir of our father has to go to Egypt. That's the payment of the debt. If you want it, you're welcome to have it. Esav says, I'm out of here. I'm going to Har Seir. I'm leaving. I don't want Canaan. If that's the cost, I'm not going. So Yaakov accepted at that moment, he's going to pay the debt. So if Yaakov's going to pay the debt, so that means he understood he has to go to Egypt. And yet it says in the Medrash that if Yosef wouldn't have been in Egypt, Yaakov would have been taken there in iron shackles. How do you reconcile? Here he tells Esav, you want it? It's going to cost you. This is the cost. I'm happy I'll take it. Esav says, I'm not interested. I'm out of here. But now that Yaakov took it, so if that's the case, fair and square, you go. He would have resisted. He would have been had to take with shackles. How do you reconcile the two? The answer is the same answer what Rabbi Shlomo explains by Avraham Avinu. The reality of Yaakov was Yaakov Ishtam Yoshev. He was a holy entity. Putting him in there was taking him to Gehenna. He couldn't tolerate the impurity. So even though intellectually understanding, I have to go there because that's the bondage. And that's the future. It has to be. But physically, he'd have to be pulled there in shackles. Hashem, for the sake of not creating a chil Hashem that a man of Yaakov's dimension should be taking shackles, he had Yosef there, and Yosef being there, he went willingly that he didn't have to be forced to go there. The exact same understanding what Rabbi Shol explains by the Akedah. I mentioned that the Sephora says Levi, because he was the last of the brothers to pass away, and they were under his tutelage for that extended period. That's why they did not become pagans. The others that the heads of the families passed away sooner, they were more receptive or more influenced by the Egyptian culture. Now, what guaranteed, we said the reason why we married redemption is Shloshinu Lishona Malbusham Ushmam. They retained their Jewish identity. There was a pride. Why was that a pride? So the Medrash tells us that Levi was not part of the bondage. So how did Levi occupy the time? When the Jews were out in the field working, they would go out with scrolls and they would explain to them what kind of pedigree they had. You know who you descend from. You're not slaves. You come from royalty. And they explained to him who Avram was, who Yitzchak was, who Yaakov was. So if not for Levi, the Jews would have gone into the oblivion. They would have shedded their identity. They would have become Egyptianized totally. So the only reason why that spark remained in them, and because it expressed itself in pride, the language, the name, and the dress, was only because of Levi. Why did Hashem have Levi pass away the longest? So Levi should not be influenced by the Egyptian culture, because Levi is the key to the future, because they have to be in a position to go out, not be part of the bondage. They're receptive to Amram telling him, don't show your ability. So they were not enslaved. Therefore, they're available, and they have a level of belief due to the tutelage of their forefather, that they go out, they're able to infuse the Jews with this pride and understanding where they come from, which ultimately, that was the basis why they married redemption.
Uh,